Welcome, gun runner.
Hello everybody, Q&A the Laird here, and I'm back with a new episode of the Laird's Lowdown, but from a rather different viewpoint, as you'll probably see, because I'm having to sit down today to do this one, because I have the best of trouble standing usually anyway, but I've just come out of hospital after having an operation on my already surgically repaired ankle, to try and make my standing ability and walking ability a little bit easier for me, and I'm in a great deal of pain and I cannot stand at all. So seated I am in front of my bookshelf and some game shelves, and there's my good old Vectrex there in its carry case. So a little bit of a different viewpoint, but I digress. That's not the subject of today's video, because as you can see from the title, we are talking about the world's oldest games producer. And you might be already thinking, Netflix bought Warner Brothers, didn't they? It's been in all the news. Yes, and you might not know the connection between that, because Warner Brothers are indeed the world's oldest producer of video games that are still in existence, and I'll explain why. And let's go back to that detail for a moment, though, the news even for a moment, because obviously we all know about this deal that's now in place for Netflix to buy Warner Brothers. It's still subject to all sorts of approval, so it's not guaranteed at the moment it will go through, but it certainly looks likely. It previously like Paramount were going to buy Warner Brothers, but it now looks like Netflix are. And originally, it wasn't clear if Netflix's deal just included the studios of Warner Brothers, or whether it included everything they did. And it turns out that it includes the film studios, obviously Warner Brothers Studios, and it also includes Warner Brothers Interactive, the video game company. It doesn't include DC Comics or anything like that. But interestingly, to see that, very interesting indeed to see that the games company is included in that, Warner Brothers Interactive. I know Netflix have tried to get into games already and not really done much. They kind of messed it all up, and they had all these grand plans, and then they ended up laying loads of people off, and nothing's really come out of Netflix's want to get into gaming. So I guess by buying Warner Brothers Interactive, that gives them that route into the games industry that they've wanted to get for some time. So I'm not surprised that they insisted on Warner Brothers Interactive being part of the deal. But let's go back to tell you why Warner Brothers Interactive are the oldest software company in the world, or games developer, or however you want to put it, games company. Because a lot of you probably won't know this. Some of you will, I'm sure. I think it's important and interesting to give their history. So many will know that in 1976, Warner Brothers purchased Atari from Nolan Bushnell for a rather large sum of money. I can't remember what it was, 28 million, I think, something like that. And therefore entered the games industry at that point. Then Atari were just making arcade games. But we soon saw things like Home Pong, and of course, the year after, the Atari 2600 in 1977. And that changed everything. That really did launch the video games industry. And there's no way that would have happened without Warner Brothers, because Warner Brothers pumped a substantial amount of money into Atari to get the 2600 out, and to get the games and advertising, get it into stores and make it this worldwide phenomenon. Warner Brothers had all the contacts and the cash to make that possible. Warner Brothers were already the biggest film studio in the world. They were already the biggest record company, I believe, in the world as well at that point. And they soon became the biggest games company in the world. And it continued from there, really. And then, of course, in 1984, there was the North American video game crash, which had a great big effect, obviously, on the arcade industry there, but also the console industry. Although there were two separate crashes, I must emphasise they weren't the same thing. And they were caused by different things. The arcade crash was caused by there just being too many arcade games out there that nobody wanted to play anymore, and it was very expensive for the arcades to buy new ones. So the model changed into terms of arcade games that could be replaced, cabinets where you could swap the games around and stuff. So that made the model change. Arcade games didn't go anywhere, they just changed the model, but arcade revenues fell massively because of that, because there was this period of change within the arcade industry. And then obviously the console crash we know about, because the market became flooded with lots of bad games and there was too many consoles to choose from as well. It's a combination of things that I spoke about actually in great detail in my video that came out last weekend about the things that Nintendo didn't invent. So if you haven't seen that, go watch that, because I actually gave a large portion of that video to the reasons why Nintendo didn't save the video games industry, which a lot of people claim they did. And I talked a lot about the crash and what really happened and stuff in that video. So if you want to know more, go check that out, because I'm really proud of that video. And it's got a great response as well. But yes, and in 1984, Atari was effectively split into two. Warner Brothers sold the consumer division to Jack Tramiel, of course, where it became Atari Corporation, but they hung on to the arcade division, which they kept running, and it continued to be profitable, actually. And then in 1987, they decided they wanted to get back into making console games and computer games and get back into that market of making video games. And the reason why they hadn't done it until then was because in 1984, when they signed the deal to sell the consumer division to Jack Tramiel, there was an agreement in place that Atari Corporation couldn't make any arcade games. They were barred from making arcade games with the Atari name. In return, they would license the Atari name to Warner so they could carry on using it for their arcade games. But on the basis of Warner Brothers were not allowed to re-enter the home market making games under the Atari games, as it became, name. They could not use the Atari name to make home games. So they decided, okay, we'll just create another label then. Simple as that, we just won't call it Atari. So in 1997, they created the label Tengen, and the name was well chosen because Atari comes from the game Go, which was Nolan Bushnell's favourite board game. And it kind of means checkmate, basically. And Tengen is the centre part of the board on Go. So they used another term from the same game. And they originally set Tengen up to make conversions of their arcade games for the NES. They'd previously been licensing their games to other people. Like, for example, they licensed Paperboy and Marble Madness to Mindscape. Good example there. And they were doing very well, and they thought, we want a piece of this pie for ourselves. So they decided to set up that. And initially, they were going to be official Nintendo licensed company. So their first few games, which I think were RBI Baseball, Pac-Man, and something else, I can't remember what the other one was, were all officially licensed games. But they were clever because basically when they initially signed the deal with Nintendo to produce games for the NES, Tengen and Warner said, we don't like the terms of your agreement, and they tried to renegotiate them, and Nintendo had none of it because they said everybody has to sign this agreement, which means you cannot release more than 5 games a year, full stop. Of course, Konami famously got around that by creating Ultra games. They could release twice as many. And the second thing was that you couldn't release those games that you released on the NES for anyone else's platform for 2 years. So that was the second condition. And Tengen said, no, we don't like this because we want to license our games to other people so they can release them for other systems. And we also want to release more than 5 games because we release all these arcade games in the year and we want to port all of those to the NES. Plus we want to port some of our older properties and stuff like that. And Nintendo had none of it. But in the meantime, what they did, of course, was reverse engineer the lockout chip that Nintendo had already provided them the code for, obviously, to make games. And they were very clever, and they found a way of reverse engineering it and making their own lockout chips, which led to lawsuits with Nintendo, and some which they lost, like the Tetris lawsuit famously, but some they won because later on in the 80s there was an antitrust lawsuit which was brought by several parties, including Atari Corporation and Atari Games, which is one reason why those companies then made up again somewhat, and we started to see some Atari Games properties released for like the 7800 and Lynx, for example. So yeah, there was a kind of making up between the companies when they joined together for that antitrust lawsuit with Sega as well, which they won. But yes, they carried on. Tengen also ended up producing games for the Mega Drive, for Master System, Game Gear. They did a couple of PC Engine games, Sega CD games. Then they licensed the Tengen name and properties to Domark in the UK to release games for home computers under the Tengen banner. So it was used for home computer games as well. And yeah, they were very successful in that venture. Then at one point, the arcade Atari games was actually sold by Warner to Namco, but Warner retained a stake in the company, and actually Warner still owned a stake in Atari Corporation as well. They were still a major shareholder, because when they sold the company to Jack Tramiel, they retained a shareholding in the company. I can't remember how much it was. I think it was something like 20% though. It's quite large. And so they were still in that sector even after they sold Atari games to Namco. They remained a minority shareholder in both those companies. Then they ended up eventually they bought Atari games back. Atari games actually had a management buyout first, I think, that took it off Namco, and then I think Warner ended up buying them back. And then in 1996, was it? I'm pretty sure in saying 1996, Midway Games, or formerly Bally Midway, bought Atari Games, lock, stock and barrel. They bought the whole company. They already owned Williams Electronics, Bally Sente, Trade West, Leyland Corp. So they already owned lots of other arcade companies that had taken over, but they then bought Atari Games, kept them going for a little while before just merging them completely into Midway, effectively shutting them down. But they still continued to use the name somewhat, because we had like the Atari Collection, for example, for PlayStation, published by Midway, featuring those former Atari properties like Paperboy and stuff like that, Gauntlet, etc. And then in 2009 actually, Midway went bust, and they were bought in 2010 by who? Warner Brothers. So that Warner connection just kept going through all that time, and that meant that Warner Brothers once again owned the Atari Games properties. They were only Atari Games again, as well as obviously Midway, Williams, and those other names I just mentioned. So that carried on, and they did indeed revive a couple of Atari Games properties. They did a new version of Gauntlet, you might remember, for, I think it was for PlayStation 3 or 4, I can't remember now what it was for, and PC. So they did a new Gauntlet game. They did a new Paperboy game as well. I think it was just for mobile phones. And then they did like Midway Treasures compilation that had loads of Atari stuff on it as well. So they didn't completely forget about Atari, though they completely wasted the IP, really. We haven't seen any more collections since Midway Treasures, which was a PS3 and Xbox 360 release. It's strange how they've just completely ignored all those properties that they've owned. And really the only thing that they seemed to be interested in when they took over Midway was Mortal Kombat. It's the only thing they've done anything with. Most of the other old Midway properties and stuff that they've kind of ignored. We did get the Rampage film, though, which was kind of nice, wasn't it? Because, of course, that was a Midway property. And there was a new there was a new Rampage arcade game to go with that, but that was done by Raw Thrills, who, of course, were all ex-Midway and Williams staff at Raw Thrills, mostly. Eugene Jarvis of Williams, once of Williams, is the head of Raw Thrills, so there's a connection there. But that's it. That's how Warner are the oldest video game company in the world, because Midway were already the oldest arcade company in the world of making arcade games that still existed, and Atari were obviously the oldest still existing maker of console games, and they brought those two together. So then they became the oldest publisher of both arcade and home console games, and now they're owned by Netflix. So yeah, my thoughts, because we've got a long bit of history there. We don't usually do this in Laird's Lowdown. These are usually just opinion videos, but I felt like it was important to go through all of that rather than just me saying this is what I think, because I think the background information is important to this, because they have this fantastic legacy, and this is my concern: is that are Netflix going to recognise this legacy, or are they going to completely ignore it, like Warner Interactive have done for so many years now, or Warner Brothers Games, whatever name they've been calling themselves most recently. And I'm not sure. I think it depends who Netflix get on board, or they get some people in who know what the legacy of the company is. A bit like Atari did when they got Wade Rosen in, and that was a game changer. And I do wonder if Netflix maybe do sell off some of that IP. That'll be interesting to see. And there is already, I already saw some people online actually tagging Atari in posts online saying that they should buy all the Atari games, Bally Midway and Williams IP off Netflix if that deal goes through. And I've been saying this for years that Atari should go for that IP if they can afford it, because it would bring Atari back together as one company again, and also get them that amazing Williams, Bally Midway IP as well, and Leyland, Trade West, etc., Bally Sente. And that could be amazing if Netflix did sell that to Atari. We'll see what happens, or whether they have a plan to embrace their retro legacy. But I'm not convinced Netflix will do that. I think Netflix want just to get into games, make new games. I think they'll obviously continue Mortal Kombat because that's a big money spinner. Obviously means that they can use maybe some of these properties for films as well. So they might take over the Mortal Kombat films. We might maybe get some other, I don't know, Midway-based films. Who knows? Unlikely, but we'll see what happens. We did get Rampage. That was a surprise in itself. But yeah, it's going to be interesting times to see how this goes. But at the moment, my gut feeling is that Netflix won't want to do anything with the video game IP, the old gaming IP. They mainly want the movie studio, and they wanted a way to get into games. And I think they want to make new games based, a lot of their new games, I think, were based on Netflix-owned properties already. Things that, shows that they have on Netflix, like maybe Stranger Things or something like that, or Black Mirror and all these other things that they have on Netflix now. We might see some video games based on some of those properties. I'm not sure that we will get anything in regard to the old IP that they own except Mortal Kombat, and I do kind of hope that they will sell it, and I think that Netflix would be open to selling it, because I think they'll want to recoup some of the huge amounts of money that they've spent on acquiring Warner Brothers. But yeah, and it'd be interesting to see what it does for the film industry, because apparently one of the conditions is the Warner Brothers takeover that they have to carry on releasing films in the cinema, and Netflix has said that they intend to do that after previously stating that they thought that cinema was dead and that they would never put their films in the cinemas, because obviously after Amazon Prime bought MGM, they carried on putting films into the cinema, although, albeit on Prime very short time after, quite often. Almost, I've seen films come onto Prime a month after they've been in the cinema now, which is mad. Mad. You think we waited like a year for films to come onto VHS tape back in the day. So, and they did, Netflix came out and said, no, we're not going to do what Prime did. Our films were just for streaming. Streaming is the future. No one goes to cinema anymore. But now they've had to kind of wheel back on that because of the Warner Brothers takeover, and say we will continuing to support cinemas, or movie theatres as Americans call them, and putting those films out there. So, and I hope they do. I hope they don't row back on that. I've got a feeling though that they will scale back massively, a bit like Amazon have done actually. Amazon, they're not releasing that many in the cinema, and there's lots of films that were meant to be in the cinema that they've ended up putting on Prime instead. Roadhouse being a really good example of that. So we'll have to wait and see. There's a lot of variables at the moment, but I hope that they continue supporting the cinema with the Warner Brothers name and logo and everything like that. I hope they don't destroy that legacy of Warner Brothers in that sector, and Looney Tunes and stuff like that as well. But with the game stuff, I actually think it'd be better if Netflix sold that IP, and I think Atari would be the right person to sell it to. But we'll see. But I'd love to know what you all think. Anyway, that's what this video is all about. So let me know what you think about the Warner Brothers Netflix deal, what you hope they do with all that amazing IP that they've obtained by buying Warner. And yeah, I can't wait to read your comments down below. So as always, I've been the Laird. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon. Bye bye.